So I just want to make this vlog out to say that last night's loss by the New York Mets was not the worst loss of the season. It was a bad loss, yes, but it was not the worst loss of the season. This video I'm going to describe why, this loss wasn't the worst of the season and why it's an overreaction. And there's two angles to this. First of all, you have the perspective that the season's over. Well, once the Mets fell out of a playoff spot following their loss on July 31st, I could tell that the season was probably over. I could tell that they have lost a ton of momentum at that point, that their miracle June and July was starting to come to an end. You lost. Once Sal Lutica declared the NL wildcard race to be over, once the Mets reached the 4th seed, everything went wrong. Senga got injured. They lost the next two games in humiliating fashion. And even though they won the series against the Twins, you could see the Pods and D-backs taking off. And now the Mets are in a position where they can't catch them without them having a historic collapse. That would have to be even more significant than the collapse of the 2023 Chicago Cubs, which, believe me, the 2023 Chicago Cubs was a historic collapse. You'd have to have one on that level, at least, in order to have that happen. You also have to realize how the Braves, the Mets probably can't beat the Braves in a war of attrition. They're getting some guys back. The Braves are not always bad. They can be good. And the Mets are injured too, but I don't know when Marte's coming back. Senga's not coming back until at least the playoffs, if the Mets even make it there. So I could already tell the season was over. Plus, you had a horrible series loss to the Angels. When we got swept by the Mariners, our season was already over. Even when we were in a playoff spot, our season felt over. Now, what I will disagree with Mets fans on is that this is okay. This is obviously unacceptable. The Mets should be a playoff team. They outplayed the NL champions last year in terms of run differential, and I'm not even kidding when I say that. The 2023 Mets were an injured team that got unlucky, and it felt like in 2024, bounce back from that. Maybe, you're not getting 101 wins again, but maybe you can get to 86 and make the playoffs. First of all, 86 wins ain't getting you into the playoffs this year. It just won't. And second of all, I don't think the Mets can achieve that when they're in a tailspin. I know that at mid-season I predicted them to be at 88 wins. I have to lower that all down to 78 now. I really think that they can't keep a good pace for the rest of the season. Now, with that being said, the Mets, I think this is inexcusable. I don't get why Mets fans like Mendoza or Stearns. They do nothing. Mendoza is a horrible leader. He makes horrible in-game decisions. Stearns is probably going to have the worst trade deadline in modern Mets history. And the Mets will never win a World Series with Mendoza or Stearns guiding a ship. They just never will. Honestly, they'll never win a championship under the ownership of Steve Cohen. Knowing Mets fans, they're probably not winning a World Series again in our lifetimes. They're probably not. There will be a day when the Mets win another World Series that will probably not be for a very long time. I would say 2070s. This is another time where it's really what shaped up to be potentially our year, and the Mets blew it in catastrophic fashion. And the Mets front office's refusal to fix the situation is baffling. There's obviously the argument that Mendoza and Stearns a first year, so unless they say something egregiously offensive or they are egregiously bad, you can't fire them. But keeping them just means the Mets will be doomed into a constant state of mediocrity, where, especially considering MLB's playoff system, they'll never make it in. If the MLB had a better playoff system, then yes, the Mets probably would make it in. But then make it in and do what? Fizzle out every year? Yeah, that's my problem with Mendoza and Stearns. They choke under pressure. And Mendoza has cost us several games in big-time fashion. From not intentionally walking Jesse Winker on July 4th, which everyone from a mile coming could have seen that home run that would be the dagger for the Mets to a lot of his bullpen choices. I mean, they've just been astoundingly horrible. Mendoza refuses to learn, and he's not good. He's just horrible. But now, as to why this is not the worst Mets loss of the season, or probably not even in the top 3. The worst loss the Mets had was undoubtedly going to be May 18th. You had a 7-2 lead at one point, and in the middle of the 9th inning, the Mets held a 9-5 lead. It was 7-5 after 8. The Mets expanded that to 9-5 after 2 runs in the top of the 9th. It's so much that you put in Edwin Diaz in, it's not even a save situation. Except he allows 4 runs. Horrible decision by Mendoza to put him in, considering that he already blew the save on May 13th against the Phillies, when they had a 4-2 lead after 8, and they shit the bed on that one, losing in somewhat historic fashion. However, I feel like in that, as bad as it was the Phillies. It's hard to bottle up the Phillies. So I feel like that while that was bad, that might not, be in the top 5 of worst losses of this season. It's a bad loss, but it's probably not one of the worst losses. This game, though, is inexcusable. First of all, the Marlins are not the Phillies. They're one of the worst teams in the MLB and a team that you have to win a series against. It was a must-win game. 18-18, you fell at 20-24. So you could not afford to lose this game. You had the game seemingly wrapped up, and then they blew it. In extra innings, they could not score. The Marlins could. The Marlins win 10-9 in extra innings after coming back and being down 5-9. Now, the second worst loss is going to be less than a week later on May 24th. I feel like the Mets' May, as bad as it was almost better than in August, because at least you had some semblance of hope if Mendoza could get his shit together, because they lost a lot of very winnable games. And this, oh boy, was a winnable game. Had a 6-2 lead after 7, then proceeded to allow a grand slam in the top of the 8th to make it 7-6 in favor of the Giants. Then when you went down 8-7 in the bottom of the 9th, you had 1 out and you had bases loaded. So it's very easy to score there. Get a single and you force in a run. Get a walk and you force in a run. Sacrifice fly and you score a run. Instead, the Mets find a way to blow it and they lose 8-7. So the Giants are leading 6-2. And after having a greater than 50% chance to win, in the final frame. Another time when this happened was the failed sacrifice fly on May 1st. That whole controversy in the Mets-Cubs game about the whole illegal blocking of the plate, where McNeil clearly was trying to do a sacrifice fly, but it turned out to be a line-out double play because he got caught out and they beat Alonso to the plate. Usually sacrifice flies will result in a runner being scored, and that game ended 1-0. Can't call it one of the 5 worst, but that definitely was a stinging loss for the Mets. Thankfully, ball doesn't lie. The Mets came back from being down 4-0 the next day to win 7-6 in extra innings. So the Mets at least were able to make up for that loss, even though their putrid May would begin after, their mediocre April feelings. Now, as for the Mets, another horrible loss by the Mets, we can go to June 29th. So this is a different kind of loss, because in May, these losses were somewhat predictable, where the Mets were losing games in historic fashion. By June, though, it looked like the Mets had started to get the ship together, and you could almost think of the Mets as a serious playoff team. They went from being down 24-35 to climbing up to 40-39, so they got on their first winning record since May 2nd after the 4-0 comeback against the Cubs, and everything was looking right, and they were in prime position to take the series against the Houston Astros. Unfortunately for the Mets, they could not do that. The Mets were up 6-1, but McGill was bad, the bullpen exploded, and the Mets lost 9-6 to the Houston Astros. The loss the next day, while it isn't in the top 5, obviously coming back from being down 4-0 to force extras at 4-4, only to then explode in extra innings as it's 5-5 after 10. You had a guy on third and no outs, and you couldn't score with it. And then proceeding to have the 11th inning massacre with Matt Festa, where you make the score 10-5 and lose, especially after a 2.5 hour rain delay. And yes, there was a 2.5 hour rain delay because there were severe storms in Queens. I mean, that's just horrible and putrid and embarrassing. And you cannot lose those kinds of games. But again, not quite as bad as some of the others because the Mets could have just fizzled out and died 4-0. They at least made a comeback and made somewhat of an effort before they collapsed. So that's why. July 3rd, again, middle of the fifth, you lead 5-0, and then you just choke the entire game away. So another horrible loss by the Mets there. You also have some other really bad losses by the Mets, like April 4th, where you lead 3-0 and lose 6-3 in extras. I mean, that's just a horrible loss. Again, not every loss is as bad as this one, because this year blowing a 5-run lead. But it's not like it's the first time the Mets blew a 5-run lead. They led 5-0 at the 3, and by the end of the fourth, it was already 6-4. So, I mean, this loss was somewhat predictable. It obviously stings, and this could be the dagger, but I do think that that this loss, number one, the dagger already happened, and that this loss wasn't the worst of our season.